Okay. Hello. Thanks everybody for joining us today. So we are going to start off with our first session on migration and displacement. We have four really great presentations, starting off with Jacob van Leeuwen on the long run and intergenerational effects of natural disaster exposure, evidence from Galveston Hurricane of 1900. Jacob is a recent PhD graduate from economics department in Texas A&M University, and will be starting a postdoctoral research as a researcher at Brigham Young University Record Linkage Lab in September. Jacob's research interests are applied microeconomics, including public economics, urban economics, and economic history. We will follow that with a presentation from Hero Ashman on the Black migration, domestic exploitation, and white reproduction in the US from 1900 to 1940. Hero is a PhD student at UC Berkeley. She studies labor and how some groups are advantaged from other groups' work. And her dissertation focuses on domestic workers during the Great Migration. Third, we will have Sara Ronnkvist, sorry, and on the historical post-disaster migration across the life course, evidence from a century of linked US census. Sara is an environmentalist demographer and sociologist, currently in her sixth year at the sociology department at Wisconsin-Madison, and is a pre-doctoral fellow at the Center for Demography and Ecology. Her work analyzes how environmental changes and extreme climate events may influence fertility, migration, and population health. And then we'll finish out with a presentation from David Van Riper on the highway displacement, proximity, and mortality from the impacts of I-10 construction in Tucson, Arizona. And David serves as the director of spatial analysis at the Minnesota Population Center and is co-principal investigator on IPUMS NHGIS, and is a collaborator on this project with Rae Anne Martinez. And so that is our four presentations today. So Jacob, if you want to start off.
All right, I'm happy to be here today. I'll present some work that I have on the long-run effects of natural disaster exposure, evidence from the Galveston Hurricane of 1900. Just to kind of introduce the topic, some questions that I've been interested in answering throughout my research is, how does where we live affect health, labor market outcomes, and human capital development? Specifically looking at things like environmental shocks, do these shocks have effects that last far beyond the immediate disruption? And do these effects even persist intergenerationally? So in this specific paper, what I'll be looking at is understanding the long-run and intergenerational effects of natural disaster exposure. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go too much into the literature, but I do add to three areas of literature. I'm looking at intergenerational effects, natural disasters, place and migration, and interestingly, there's this in literature within economics with several papers looking at hurricanes specifically. But to provide some background on why I'm studying this hurricane, the Galveston Hurricane of 1900. So on September 8th, 1900, a Category 4 hurricane made landfall near Galveston. This, even to this day, is the deadliest natural disaster in US history. Estimates range from somewhere between 6,000 to 12,000, but most people who study this hurricane usually say about 8,000 people died. To give you some context, this caused similar economic damage to Katrina and Harvey, two more recent hurricanes that a lot of people I think are more familiar with. The reason I study this hurricane is because of two useful institutional details. The hurricane occurred only a few months after the 1900 census, so we have about as good as we can get in historical data for the precise location of where individuals were living at the time of the storm. Second, contemporary news reports identify cities and towns which sustained significant damage. You can see an example of this on the right here. This is a column from the Houston Post a couple days after the storm with some pretty preliminary estimates of the damage from the storm. And these are several towns in and around Galveston and Houston in Southeast Texas that had significant damage. I'm going to combine those contemporary news reports with linked census data from the Record Linking Lab. I'm going to restrict it to individuals who were living in 11 counties in Southeast Texas in 1900. You can think of these counties as being what today we would consider the greater Houston metro area and some outlying counties. The nice thing about these linked data is I can link parents to children and can look at second generation outcomes. It's the IPUMS data, so I have lots of very rich data. And then the other really nice thing is working with the BYU Record Linking Lab. They've been linked to a large genealogical database to obtain death information, and then I can use that to estimate lifespan, which is the difference between birth year and death year. But as with most research, there's some tricky things. One of the things that's tricky is in the news records, I see names of towns, but actually in the census records, we don't actually see those towns frequently in the names. So an interesting quirk about Texas is Texas divides its counties into justice precincts, which are just administrative districts that are at the sub-county level. In early censuses, frequently you don't actually see small towns in the census. You see the justice precinct in which they're located. That's true for most towns except for really large cities like Houston and Galveston. So what I actually have to do here is I use census enumeration district maps from 1900 to 1940, and I determine which census locations had a town that was significantly damaged. I'll get to what that means in just a minute. So for example, here, this is the Justice Precinct containing Angleton, Texas, which you can see in the gray square in the top left. Angleton, Texas was essentially wiped out by the storm and then rebuilt after. We can see here that it's actually in Justice Precinct 1. So I am able to use that to figure out where these towns are located. And then I do a standard differences and differences identification strategy where I compare towns that were significantly damaged by the hurricane with similar towns nearby that weren't. Tricky thing here is for some outcomes, I'm unable to observe them prior to treatment, so I estimate a reduced form equation, things like employment and lifespan. So I just do a reduced form comparison, directly comparing the treated and control towns. So the other tricky thing here is how do I define treatment? I end up using contemporary news reports to determine cities and towns that sustained major damage from the storm. And I'm going to define treatment as severe damage is identified by at least 2 news sources. So on the left here, we have an example of severe damage. These are both from the El Paso Herald in the week following the storm. So Pearland and Alvin on the left, those were near Galveston, on the coast pretty much. And it says that, excuse me, all houses were gone, all buildings swept away. On the right, you have an example of less damage. This is Waco and Bastrop, which are about 200 miles inland. So they still got some damage from the storm, but you can see there's a pretty clear difference between the town doesn't exist anymore and some houses lost their roof. So to give you an idea of exactly what we're looking at in Southeast Texas, this is the spatial distribution of impacted towns. This is mapped to 2,000 census subdivision, county subdivisions. So the boundaries aren't exact, but you can see it's largely towns that are along the southwest edge of the Houston metropolitan area. So getting into some summary statistics of what these individuals look like living in these towns. Based on baseline demographics, they appear fairly similar, which is great for identification. The one exception here is there is a small difference in age, but in all the results I'll show you, I control flexibly for thank you, for birth year, and it doesn't impact my results. So getting into results, first looking at migration, we see that unsurprisingly, individuals living in impacted towns are 7 percentage points more likely to move following the storm. I do split results by children and adults. This follows some earlier work in the economics literature by Emi Nakamura and co-authors. What we see here is really the migration response of children and adults is fairly similar. Next, it's interesting to see where exactly did they move. If we look at hurricane movers, they move largely, it looks like, to the 3 major urban centers in Texas. So for those of you unfamiliar with Texas geography, these 3 dark spots here are Houston, San Antonio, and Dallas-Fort Worth. It looks like most of the movement is more further afield in Texas. In contrast, the control movers are largely staying in roughly the same area. There is some movement to some of those urban centers, but it's a lot less. And then a really interesting thing here is looking at life expectancy. So a thing that I don't think I mentioned earlier is I restrict my sample to individuals who are in both the 1900 and 1910 census to get around the fact that if people don't link to the 1910 census, I can't really tell if it's because they died in the storm or they just didn't link because linking is hard. So conditional on surviving the storm through the 1910 census, we can see that in the first generation, regardless of whether you were a child or an adult, you're almost 2 years shorter lifespan. Interestingly, in the second generation, if your parent was an adult at the time of the storm, but you yourself were not yet born, you live nearly 3 years shorter on average. These are pretty large lifespan effects that point to the persistent impacts of the storm on very long-run outcomes. Another long-run outcome and intergenerational outcome I look at is, I'm an economist, so I'm curious about labor market performance. We see we see decreased labor force participation for the first generation in 1910, and we see that for the second generation in 1930. We also see decreased employment through 1930 for the first generation and the second generation, which points to these very persistent effects of the hurricane. It's important to know that these effects do go away in 1940, but there were a large number of government policies like the New Deal that tried to increase people's labor force participation and employment, so I'm not super surprised by that. One reason we could be seeing these decreases in labor force participation and employment may be because of less human capital development. I proxy for that with literacy rates. We see a marked decrease in literacy rates following the storm on the order of 4 to 5%. These are persistent all the way through 1930, which is the last census year for which we have literacy before the census switched to asking about education. An interesting thing that I've found here looking at occupation is that you do see a decrease among individuals who were over 21, who were adults at the time of the storm in 1910, but that effect goes away. Interestingly, you see this really large increase in employment among children at the time of the storm, starting in 1920 through 1930. Still trying to figure out what exactly that is. It's Texas, so the answer to a lot of things in Texas is unsurprisingly oil. I do know that the first two big oil discoveries happened actually in 1901, but then again in the 1920s and 1930s in East Texas. So that could be driving some of the results here. But further research is required for that. So for future research or for future steps on this project, I'm currently working with the Galveston History Center on their 1900 storm victims database. This is going to lead to a lot of interesting research looking at bereavement effects and things like that, but as well as I can see how this effect on survivors on lifespan compares to the effect of the individuals who actually died in the storm. One of the other things I want to look at is I want to estimate migration results on the intensive margin and compare it with the extensive margin. The results I showed you here is just looking at if they moved at all. I'm curious if this storm leads people to become kind of repeat movers. They're no longer settled in a location, and so they're more likely to move around multiple places over the course of their life. And then third, I want to look at the relative importance of migration location on mortality and labor market outcomes. Is it something about the negative effects of the storm itself that's driving the results I see, or is it based on where they end up moving to that's driving my results? Cool, I think that's all I have. I'm happy to answer questions or answer questions at the end of the seminar, or at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to Cheyenne for chairing this session. My name is Hero. I'm a grad student in sociology at UC Berkeley. Today I'm going to be presenting a paper from my dissertation. You probably noticed the title is slightly different. I was trying to shorten it, but I actually don't know if it succeeded. But the title now is Marriage and the Racial Division of Reproductive Labor. So, a large body of research explores the relationship between access to economic resources and marriage timing. And it finds that access to things like land, jobs, and assets allows people to get married at earlier ages. But in order to use these resources, domestic labor is needed to convert them into kind of consumable goods and services within a household. Land and homes need to be maintained, wages need to be spent. But theories of marriage timing often take this labor for granted. It's either left out entirely or kind of assumed to be done for free within households, oftentimes by women. And although the majority of this work is done for free within households, a significant portion is also outsourced to the labor market in the form of paid domestic services. And the labor market for domestic workers specifically is structured along a racial and gendered hierarchy, where oftentimes the more menial reproductive tasks are outsourced to women of lower status racial ethnic groups. And this is something that the scholar Evelyn Nicotto-Glenn refers to as the racial division of reproductive labor. So in my paper, I ask whether access to domestic labor can affect entry into marriage in a similar way that access to land and jobs might do. And specifically, I focus on how the racial hierarchy shapes people's access to paid domestic labor, which can look different in different historical contexts. So for my historical case, I look at Black women domestic workers during the early wave of the Great Migration, which is around 1910 to 1940. And so during the first 4 decades of the 20th century, about 1 million Black women left the rural South and settled in cities across the US. And this is cities in the South as well as in other places as well. And these women faced extreme occupational segregation. They were essentially blocked from all work other than domestic work. For some people, for some Black women, they worked as live-in servants in white urban households, but for the most part, they worked as day workers, domestic workers, or as laundresses in cities. And the scale of Black women's migration over this period really shifted the labor market for domestic workers. It both increased the supply of domestic workers in cities, but it also changed the racialized kind of ideal of who was most appropriate to do this labor. So earlier, domestic workers were thought of as young women who'd immigrated from Europe. They were kind of in training to become housewives. And over this time period, that image really shifted to be the ideal domestic worker was now a Black woman, probably from the rural South, who would have this occupation for an entire lifetime. And both these increases in the supply of workers and then also the shifting racialization of the labor market meant that it was easier for white urban households to outsource some of their domestic labor to Black women. And I asked whether these changes to the labor market for domestic workers increase the likelihood of marriage among white women. So specifically, I asked, did white women marry earlier in cities with higher rates of migration among Black women? So what I'm going to do now is kind of give a preview of my findings and my arguments visually, and then I'll take a step back to talk about how I got there. So I show that there is a positive association between Black women's migration to a city and the probability of marriage among white women in those cities. And this association isn't explained by city characteristics or by time trends, and nor is it explained by kind of broader time and city-specific characteristics that might have led to migration generally to cities and marriage among women in those cities. So instead, I argue, or I hypothesize that this relationship is explained by the outsourcing of some degree of domestic labor by white households to Black women who arrived in these cities as migrants. So in short, I'm proposing that marriage among one group of women was dependent on the labor of another group of women. Okay, so how did I get to these results? Like many of us here, I use full count census data from 1900 to 1940. Thank you, IPUMS. My sample is white native-born women age 16 plus who are living in cities. It's about 36 million women over this time period. And I limit to cities that have a population of 30,000 or more over the 4 decades, which is 182 cities. So I estimate two-way fixed effects models using logistic regression. I predict the probability of marriage among white women at the end of the decade based on the net migration rates of Black women in the preceding decade. Marriage here is defined as marriage currently married with a spouse present, but the results are robust to different definitions. The net migration rates are estimated using a forward survival method. All my models include city and year fixed effects, as well as controls for white migration and foreign-born migration as well. The standard errors are clustered at the city level, and I fit the models separately by region and the age group of white women, and I'll talk a little bit more about why I do that next. So historical evidence points to 3 hypotheses that I have about the results. And the first one is that I only expect to see a positive association between Black migration and white marriage rates among younger white women. So over this time period, marriage was pretty much ubiquitous among white women. I'm not arguing that access to a domestic worker would affect whether someone got married, period, over a lifetime, instead that it might affect the age at which women got married. And so that's why I only expect to see an effect among the youngest white women who might change their marriage timing. Okay, so the second hypothesis is about regional variation. I expect a stronger association in southern cities where there were even fewer alternatives for employment for Black women who were migrating over this period. In southern cities as well, the low cost of hiring a domestic worker, as well as a very strict racial division of who did what jobs, meant that even white households, even quite low down the class spectrum, might expect to outsource some degree of domestic labor over this period. So I expect this effect to be more prevalent in southern cities. On the flip side, I don't expect to see any association in the West, which was having a pretty distinct had distinct migration patterns at this time. There were few Black women going west at this point of time, so I don't expect an association there. And then my third hypothesis is about the mechanism, which I spoke about a bit already. So given that my argument is that this association might be caused by white families outsourcing domestic labor to Black women, I expect to see stronger effects in cities where there were fewer employment options for Black women other than domestic labor. Okay, so now I'll go over my results. All right, so what we see here is this plot is showing the average marginal effects of a 1 standard deviation increase in the net migration rate of Black women to a city on the probability of marriage among white women. And it includes the city and decade fixed effects and additional controls. The error bars here are 95% confident intervals, though honestly, I've been struggling conceptually to understand what the error bars are in the full count census. So I'm hoping that someone in this room will be able to help me with that. Okay, speaking to hypothesis 1, which is about age variation. So we do see a positive and significant association between Black migration and white marriage for those younger age groups. So that's for white women below the age of 30, whereas we don't see that strong of an effect for women above the age of 30. For hypothesis 2 about regional variation, so as predicted, there's no significant associations in the West, and the strongest associations are in the South, while the weakest are in cities in the Northeast, so it's only that 25 to 29-year-old group that have a significant association there. And while these effect sizes are pretty small, the kind of sizable Black women's migration over this time period means that they translate into non-trivial changes in the number of white women we expect to be married. So for instance, from 1910 to 1920, Detroit experienced a surge in Black migration of about 6 times the standard deviation for cities in the Midwest. And so my estimates for the Midwest suggest that this is associated with 2,000 more white women aged 16 to 24 being married than if migration levels had remained at the 1900 to 1910 levels. Okay, so then finally to speak about my third hypothesis, so that was that the association would be stronger in cities in which Black women had fewer job alternatives to domestic labor. So I test this by interacting Black women's net migration rates with the share of female domestic workers who are Black in that city. And what these plots show is the average marginal effects, the same as we saw in the last plots, but over the distribution of cities by the share of domestic workers who are Black women. And if the association is stronger in cities in which Black women were more concentrated in domestic labor, we would expect larger effect sizes at that higher percentage, so an increasing slope. And that's what we see for some of the age groups. So in cities in the Midwest and the Northeast, the association is generally larger in cities with a higher concentration of Black women in domestic work. The exception there is for that 25 to 29-year-old group in the Midwest who didn't have a positive association. So that's what we see in the Midwest and the Northeast. In the South, we don't see this pattern. In fact, the association gets smaller in cities with a higher degree of Black women concentrated in domestic work. One thing to bear in mind is that cities in the South had a much higher share of Black women in domestic labor than in other parts of the country. It's kind of 80% or higher. So it's possible that this isn't a good test, like the beyond a certain threshold, this isn't a great test for the degree of racialization of the labor market for domestic workers. It's also possible that there's a different mechanism at play in southern cities. All right, so to conclude, I use full count census data to show that white women married earlier in cities with higher rates of migration among Black women. In cities in the Northeast and the Midwest, the association is stronger in cities with greater siloing of Black women into domestic work, which I argue is evidence that white women married earlier because they were able to outsource some of the reproductive labor of marriage to domestic workers. The results for the Northeast and the Midwest, I also run those with an instrumental variable for Black women's migration, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A if people are interested in that. In the South, we see the strongest effect sizes, but the associations are not stronger in cities where a higher share of domestic workers are Black women, which might point to a different mechanism at play here. So overall, I show that the labor of some women enables the marriage and household formation of other women. And I think these results speak to the need to study family formation and the subsequent family inequality that comes from that from a relational as well as from a comparative perspective. So thank you very much for listening.
Hi, everyone. As introduced earlier, my name is Sara Ronnkvist, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, here to present some work in progress in collaboration with Jack DeWaard, Katherine Curtis, and Elizabeth Fussell, entitled Historical Post-Disaster Migration Across the Life Course, Evidence from 1 Century of Linked U.S. Censuses. To date, we know very little about historical migration, and even less about its environmental drivers due to significant data limitations, historically, and also measuring migration generally. We do know that the U.S. population was highly mobile and unusually so, especially compared to its peer countries at the time. We also know that drought and its impacts on agriculture were a driver of migration historically, as drought would impact farm income and employment opportunities, thus encouraging people to out-migrate elsewhere in order to earn additional income or other employment opportunities. We do know a bit more about environmental migration today. For example, we know that recovery resources tend to help people stay in place through forms of insurance payouts, resources from FEMA or other federal government aid, which help people rebuild in place, or they can draw on social networks or personal savings. Additionally, people's overall likelihood of migration does influence the likelihood of migrating after disaster, with a common example being age, where young adults are more likely to migrate more generally and after experiencing a disaster. Taken together, two literature suggests that we might expect higher post-disaster migration historically compared to today, as the populations were already more mobile, thus people were already primed to migrate when experiencing shocks. There also were limited recovering resources, as the current insurance, infrastructure, and federal recovery aid didn't really exist historically. While in some cases you could get resources after disaster, these were often delayed, as it had to be an entire act through Congress versus today, where it's already built in through FEMA. We also may expect differential migration patterns, as taken from contemporary examples of differences between age groups, racial groups, socioeconomic status, etc. Bringing me to my current project, where we're investigating whether and how longer-term migration patterns in disaster-affected places deviate from existing migration patterns. So how do we do this? We link a bunch of data. So first, we use linked demographic data provided through the IPUMS full count census data and the Census Tree Project. We use county crosswalks and various environmental and climate disaster data. For a bit more details, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the IPUMS USA full count US Census data, which includes the full counts, as these censuses are declassified after 72 years, and they're fully harmonized. They're very easy to use. We then link people using linkages provided by the Census Tree Project, which links people from 1850 through 1940. And this linkage effort provides a uniquely high number of quality matches as they incorporate prior linkage efforts and Ancestry website data, allowing them to capture more people, such as hard-to-measure populations as women and marginalized communities. Finally, we have to put people in consistent boundaries over place, as the US geography was changing rapidly over this period of time. To do this, we also used previously provided harmonization historical boundaries provided by the Census Place Project, which places everyone into 2016 US counties. And these are very easily linked to the census tree. So all in all, measuring migration is super easy if you have a lot of computing power to link people. It's a little bit harder to identify historical disasters, as there's very limited geospatial data sets. A few exceptions are PRISM, which is historical precipitation and temperature starting in 1900, and then also hurricanes in a data set provided by James Dunn, which starts in 1900 and has hurricane records at the county level. What we do often have are reports and accounts of disasters, and things like books, government website reports, and historical societies. In these, they'll often discuss contemporary places that were impacted historically. So we compile all these reports to create a county level data set with extensive disasters. Using this method, we identified 4 floods and 3 wildfires, which were unusual in scale, creating displacement and mortality. And then we have 6 hurricanes pulled from the James Dunn data. To give you a rough idea of where we're talking about in the US, floods are pretty scattered in the east central US and in California, while wildfires are concentrated in the upper Midwest. And then hurricanes are along the Gulf Coast, which most of them hitting in Florida. As a reminder, we're interested in investigating whether and how longer-term migration patterns in disaster-affected counties deviate from existing patterns. More specifically, we're interested in first understanding changes in total migration, or the general pattern of either a net increase in people or a net loss through migration. And then second, we're interested in understanding how these total migration patterns may vary among population subgroups, specifically focusing on age and race. I will note today I'll only be talking about the age results, as I've been having a bit of trouble computing the race migration by race groups due to small populations. So to do this, we use descriptive methods. We first construct 10-year county-level migration probabilities, both total and subgroup specific. And we compute migration probabilities using a denominator of the pulled from the IPUMS USA full count census, as not everyone is linked, meaning our migration probabilities are undercounts. We then compare the percent change in the probabilities in disaster-affected counties from the prior decade to the state average, as we assume a disaster-affected county would change in a similar level to the rest of the state in absence of a disaster. For example, we'll use the Pacheco Fire, which impacted my current state of residence, Wisconsin. So we have the disaster-affected counties here, and then we compare migration probability changes here to the rest of the state, noting that some counties don't have data for this period. So what do we find? Overall, we find mixed directional shifts in total in and out migration, with a few exceptions I'll go into shortly. Second, we find no substantial differences in migration across age groups, which means that we find either limited differences from the state average or the same directional shift across all age groups, where all age groups experience maybe an increase or decrease, thus very limited variation. So on to these exceptions. Quick walkthrough of this graph. These x's indicate the state average or our reference point for what we may have expected to happen. Among wildfires, we see larger changes in outmigration among fire-affected counties relative to the state average. So in this case, we have 7 counties that experience larger increases in outmigration, and then we have another 7 that experience larger decreases in outmigration. In-migration, on the other hand, has a much more consistent pattern, where we see reductions in migration, even when the state may have been experiencing an overall net increase in in-migration. Our final case example, special exception, is among hurricanes, where we see smaller increases or larger reductions in in-migration among hurricane-affected states. So you see 1 county, a smaller increase, and then 3 with with larger reductions. So to wrap up, we see no universal migration trend within or across hazards. However, we do see larger outmigration changes in wildfire-affected counties and immigration reductions in wildfire and hurricane-affected counties. Second, we see very limited variation across changes in age-specific migration patterns across disasters. So what does this actually mean in practice? So our total migration results are consistent with contemporary work, where some places may experience migration increases, others may experience decreases. It really depends on the case study. However, our age-specific results are a bit different from what we may expect in contemporary cases. We hypothesize this may be because the current sources of age variation may be less applicable in historical cases. The example being recovery resources. Today in the US, most recovery resources are tied to home ownership, both through your homeowner's insurance, which you could additionally add on flood insurance, which requires you to own your home, or also a FEMA aid, which overwhelmingly goes to homeowners. And as we know, homeownership tends to be more common as you age, as you accumulate more wealth, stay in place, put down roots, etc. However, there wasn't insurance or FEMA historically, meaning this pre-existing way of variation is not applicable. So in conclusion, we see very early advent disasters may influence longer-term population dynamics by changing the overall level of people versus compositional changes. As for next steps, I'd like to expand the analysis by exploring migration patterns by racial group to understand if we see universal changes among different racial groups. And then second, I'd like to include more case studies for wildfires and floods, as I currently only have a few, and it's pretty labor-intensive to identify them, but I'd love to have a larger sample. And second, we'd like to do a few more quality checks of our probabilities, including investigating drop duplicates or coming from the census tree linkages, where some people might match once or twice to see kind of what those differences are. We did rerun our analyses using only high-quality matches, which are individuals who are matched using at least 2 different methods from the census tree, and we find very similar conclusions, just smaller migration probabilities as we're dropping some migrants. So thank you so much for listening. I want to acknowledge the pop centers that help make the work possible and for having consistent colors, even though we're across 3 universities, to match with my slides theme. And I really look forward to your questions and engaging with everyone more throughout this conference. Thanks.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Okay, I am not Rae Anne Martinez. Unfortunately, Rae Anne could not be here today to give this presentation she was planning to, but my name is David Van Riper, and I'm giving this talk on her behalf. I'm a collaborator on this project, and I'm super excited to talk about it, maybe for the first public presentation of this work. So we're going to talk today about highway displacement, proximity, and mortality, impacts of the I-10 construction in Tucson, Arizona. So infrastructure projects across the US have been typically seen as a public good, right? Following World War II, that post-war time period, we had a big focus on projects to promote economic development, reduction in transportation costs, national defense, and modernity. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1944 provided substantial resources for the construction of nearly 40,000 miles of highway and feeder roads in the late 1940s, with the federal government offsetting the highway costs by 50%, thus by inducing states and localities to want to build these interstate highways. But of course, we know that that public good is not always good for all people out there. And these infrastructure projects may have negatively impacted health. The construction of these highway projects and other types of public developments may have resulted in the internal displacement of communities. We believe these have targeted low SES and minoritized racial and ethnic groups in neighborhoods. And displacement may be connected to health via 3 different mechanisms. We may see an increase in psychosocial stress in the short and long term. We may see a reduction in the social and material resources needed to maintain one's health. And we may see a reduction in that neighborhood cohesion and community support. But ultimately, we don't really know about the impacts on health, given some of the data infrastructure problems. And this project is trying to get at whether or not we can use these big microdata sets that we've put together at IPUMS to help study this particular type of displacement and outcome. There's other sources of evidence connecting displacement and health. Outside the US, we've done studies on urban renewal in Spain, the UK, and other European countries. Contemporary qualitative work and ecological studies, which is mostly focused on proximity to freeways or highways in the 1990s or the present, have focused mostly on black-white disparities and or displacement events, typically focused on the East Coast or the Midwest. We have not seen anything look at disparities beyond the black-white binary. We've not seen much work centering in the communities of the Southwest. Maybe there's a perception that the Southwest was undeveloped at the time, but as you'll see in these results, there was definitely a lot of development going on. And moreover, we have a lack of kind of individual level analysis, looking at the individual impacts of these displacement events on long-run outcomes. So the study aims for this project are to use various historical sources and the multi-generational longitudinal panel, or MLP, to elucidate the relationship between highway-based displacement and mortality, and 2, to examine the relationship between highway proximity and mortality. And mortality, we're measuring this as the age at death. In this presentation, we're going to discuss just aim 1. What we're really emphasizing here is, can we enumerate the displaced individuals using full count census? And we're going to focus this on the construction of an early trucking highway, which later becomes I-10 in Tucson, Arizona, as our case study to try to understand the impacts of displacement and highway proximity on health. So now to my favorite part of this talk, because it's all the data and methods that I get the most excited about. So our case study here is in Tucson, Arizona. This map is of the Tucson metro area in 1943. The darkish yellow part are the Tucson city limits. And then outside of that is kind of the rest of the metro area in Pima County. In 1940, Tucson had about just over 36,000 people. The blue line I've shown that Rae Anne has here is the route that trucks used to take as they traversed the city of Tucson. So this was the busiest single road in the state at the time in 1945 and 1948. Tucson was a major pass-through with traffic coming from Mexico, California, and other Southwest states. And a lot of this traffic went right through town, right? So the people who were living along that blue line were very exposed to a lot of truck traffic in the 1940s. As a way to divert traffic around the city, there was a proposal to build a 4-lane, 7-mile highway. That's the green line shown here. With funds from that 1944 Federal Aid Highway Act, the state and the city of Tucson proposed just that. They wanted to propose this highway that would connect a couple of state routes that would circumvent the need for trucks to go right through the city. Planning for the new route in green began in 1945, but the plans were not made public until 1947. The project encountered many delays. It wasn't until 1949 that the plans were certified. In April of 1949, the city began acquiring the properties that they needed in order to build the highway. They purchased 131 properties and condemned 6 by August of 1949, with construction beginning in December of 1950. So in some respects, this is a great case study because the timing works out really well, right? We observed people in the 1940 census. No one could have moved leading up to that, knowing that the highway was going to be built because there was no plans yet to do that. We can then observe people in 1950 right after they've been displaced, right? The land acquisition happened in 1949, and the people would have had to have moved. The cost of acquiring the property was just over $650,000 in 1940, which today is estimated at $9.2 million in 2024 money. The key area we're interested in here is, I don't think it's here, is the green part that cuts through the city of Tucson, right? So within the city limits, that's the neighborhood known as Barrio Kroger Lane. That was a predominantly poor Hispanic neighborhood in Tucson, and that's where that interstate was going to go within those city limits. So that's kind of our focal area and where we're going to be looking for the displaced population. So what do we do? Well, one, we have to create a list of addresses for displaced properties. We have to then identify the displaced residents in the 1940 full count census. That's our intent to treat population. We use propensity score matching to select an unexposed population, so who within the city limits of Tucson were not exposed to this displacement. And then we use the MLP crosswalks to link the population to both the 1950 census and the publicly available Numident file to look for the mortality outcomes. So, sounds easy, right? Well, as we all know, this is definitely not easy. And I will say this is ongoing. We're actively working on this project right now. In fact, I don't think the RAs are here right now because they're probably looking up death data right now. So we use 3 sources for some of our data. We have the original 1947 and 1949 maps of where the development was going to go. We have the deeds of transfer between residents and the city of Tucson that shows you the cost that the city paid for, as well as information on the name and the location of that property. And then we also use city directories with address and occupation. We use both the 1948 and 1949 directories. And I'm going to walk you through why we need all 3 of these pieces of information to identify the individuals. So a quick example of how we do this is one of the freeway plans within the Tucson city limits. The freeway right-of-way are the dark lines here, and they're overlaid with essentially parcel boundaries in the city of Tucson. And this includes the subdivision name, the block number, and the parcel number. No addresses, right? We just have the kind of the land plat information. And in this example, the property we're looking for is in red. It's the Cottonwood Division, Block 2, Parcel 15. So that gives us the information about the parcel description. We can then go look at the property deeds. These deeds often named the project, the Tucson Limited Access Highway Project. They give you the parcel description, and they give you the name of the people who were selling that property to the city of Tucson. We can then use the names to link back to the city directories to get the address for that particular parcel, and that's then what we're going to be needing to look them up in the full count census. So we've got to kind of do this roundabout manner to collect all the information we need to identify where these displaced residents were and whether or not they were actually displaced, right? We're kind of looking to see what would have happened. So caveats on this address list. This was very helpful in areas where the highway curved or to look at how far the freeway extended over side streets. We're unable to find all the deed transfer documents. I think Rae Anne's hoping to go to Tucson and look in the registrar's office for more information. And the house number variables are messy in the full count data in some cases. So they're hard to get at. So let's look at some of the results of the initial work that Rae Anne and the team has put together. So looking at the demographic characteristics of the displaced population compared to the rest of Tucson in 1940, and I have to look up the email where Rae Anne sent me the takeaways for this slide. The key thing to note here is that we have quite a bit of difference on Hispanics In the Barrio Kroger Lane, 87.9% of the displaced population had a Hispanic last name compared to 32% of the rest of Tucson. Interestingly, the home ownership rate was quite a bit higher in in the displaced population, 65.6% compared to 42.2%. This is indicative of stories at the time where this neighborhood, Barrio Kroger Lane, was one of the few areas where poor Hispanics or Latinos could afford to own homes. We also see here, if you look at the education, we see much less formal schooling for the displaced population compared to the rest of Tucson. In the terms of the matching exercise, where we select the unexposed population, the key takeaway here is that the propensity score matching worked quite well. All the covariates are well balanced, and that's the takeaway here. I didn't do this part, so we're trying to wing this a little bit. And then the key thing to know here, and this goes into the next bit, is that you'll see here in terms of the linkages to the Numinent file, we don't have very high link rates, right? Only 93 out of 490 of the displaced people were linked to the public Numinent file. 244 of our unexposed population were linked. And so, we wanted to then look and see whether or not we could find more mortality data, right? Are there other records that we could look at to kind of get at how long the displaced and the unexposed population may have lived? So for this summer, we've been doing that. We've been looking to collect additional mortality data using a two-step process. Death certificates become public record 50 years after the date of death in the state of Arizona, and they have a really great searchable online database. And we also use Find a Grave, which is the world's largest grave site information site with more than 250 million records. What we do is we look up individuals' names and birth dates in the full count census, and then we go look them up in these other sources. We require at least 4 matching pieces of information to create a link between the full count census and the mortality data. First, middle, or last name, year of birth plus or minus 3, same place of birth, some kind of address match, and a household member match. Sometimes we want to know whether or not they have the spouse, a parent, a child's name, that type of thing. Thus far, we've been able to locate additional death information for 40% of people who are not in the Numinent. And we're more likely to identify that information for older white individuals, non-citizens, and those with lower income. So no other real results to present yet. This is an ongoing project. But I think the key takeaway here is that we started out wondering whether we can identify displaced people in the full count census. And I think thus far the answer is yes. And so it's going to be possible to examine the relationship between displacement and mortality for what's a very small constrained geographic area, right? That actually we couldn't do without the full count data, right? You need the full count to be able to hone in on that very small neighborhood in Tucson. And we're hoping this sets us up to push this in other ways, right? Identifying other displacement events. In the 1950s and 60s saw massive amounts of urban renewal projects and continued building of interstate highways. So hopefully we can use this as setting a baseline methodology for doing this type of work in the future. Lots of collaborators to thank. Andy Fenelon and myself have been working with Rae Anne and talking about this for a couple of years now. Rae Anne just finished a postdoc here at ISRD. Lydia Otero from the University of Arizona, and our awesome student RAs, Greg Jansen and Madeline DeBruin, who have been doing that mortality data lookup this summer. So thank you.